Hello, everybody. Welcome to Charting with Dan. It's a bit late today because I've been crunching the numbers on today's Oscar nominations as well as the box office. I got as much as I could get done, Lon, but you know me, there's always more numbers I want to do. So I was crunching up to the very last minute, as a matter of fact.
Very crunchy in your corner.
It was very crunchy. So I may be looking over here because I also have some notes here that I'm going to be looking up, but so much to talk about. The Oscar nominations came out this morning. If you want to know my thoughts on them, I'm sure you hear them here, but you hear more of them, I'm sure, on SJU. I had a lot of ideas about what was nominated and when they came out, etc. We're going to talk about those, but Lon, first let's quickly look through the weekend that was at the box office. First, the top 5 domestically here in North America, and 1917 has a big debut, hot off of its Golden Globe winning Best Drama win at the Golden Globes, among others. Sam Mendes won Best Director. It came out a $37 million debut at the domestic box office as it expanded wide. It had been playing in limited release for the last couple weeks to qualify for the Academy Awards. It also got some Oscar nominations today. It came in, I believe, second place to Joker, had 10 nominations. Joker leading all movies with 11. We're going to talk about that in a minute here. But Lon, 1917, war movie, original movie, no stars. It has a lot of things, not many stars in marquee roles. Not a lot of going for it as far as selling power, but it seems like audiences, the word got out from critics and audiences. They should go see this movie.
I think this is like the ideal case for the awards boost. If the movie comes out around award season, it's a sort of surprise pick, a lot of Golden Globe nods, a lot of Oscar. I think that's the kind of thing people are ready for. I think similar to what we saw maybe a few years ago with American Sniper, kind of timed it in a similar way to really where it all hits at once, and you go from Americans having very little knowledge or awareness of a movie to all of a sudden being really inundated with getting the word out about it. And I also think, I mean, Americans do, like, not just Americans, people love a good war movie, a big bombastic throwback, inspirational, good guys doing good. I think that really can connect. And I mean, Sam Mendes, too. I saw a lot of people making fun of how heavily the ad campaign leaned into, like, from the director of Skyfall. But I think that helps. He's got
$1 billion grossing film.
He's got a couple really big hits under his belt, and I think getting the word out that this is a guy you know and a director you trust also helped.
Well, audiences saw it. They gave it an A- cinema score, which I think, given the fact that they have not been very forward in the marketing of the fact that it is the one shot, it's not a gimmick. I think it's a method in this film because it's one of my favorite movies of the year. Roth and I, by the way, will be doing our top, well, maybe 10, maybe 15. We're still talking. Our picks for the top films of the year. I think that's going to air this weekend or later this week here on Fandom Entertainment. We had so many to see. So you're going to see that, and you'll see where I rank 1917. But an A- cinema score, given the fact that may not be for everyone, that style for the film, not bad. We'll see how it does going forward. Obviously, they timed this between the Golden Globes and the Oscars with so much Oscar love today. We'll see how it holds up this weekend. If we'll see the legendary, fabled sometimes not fabled Oscar bump. We'll see how it handles all of the movies that were nominated today that are still in theaters. So 1917 number 1, but also at the domestic box office, Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker falls to number 2. Jumanji: The Next Level there at number 3. Number 4, we were just talking, Lon. If it's January, that means there's a Paramount comedy starring Tiffany Haddish coming out. Wow. This one was Like a Boss. You remember that song from a few years ago?
I was saying,
from the Lonely Island.
They kind of missed the boat on Like a Boss being like a meme by a few years.
Yeah.
It's still a phrase people know.
People say that sometimes.
Sure.
And then that's how development works. And then Just Mercy, which is another film that was in limited release to qualify for the Oscars, did not get any Oscar nominations, but is there at number 5. And speaking of cinema score, Just Mercy, while it did not have the huge debut that 1917 did get an A+ from the audiences from Cinema Score, which usually indicates that it's going to hang around a while. So we'll see how Just Mercy also grows, but not having that awards bump that I think some had anticipated perhaps for Jamie Foxx. I think that was the movie's big hope, was that Jamie Foxx would get an Oscar nomination, but audiences seem to love it.
Yeah, this is one of those movies that if you went back to the beginning of 2019 and all the forecasting, 2 titles that came up a lot when people were looking ahead at the year 2019, what are going to be the big awards players? Just Mercy and The Goldfinch.
Yeah.
And Goldfinch, was critically drubbed and
Yes.
disappeared from theaters very quickly. Just Mercy, I think, doing better, but just didn't build up the momentum that people had sort of expected.
Well, it's going to tie into what we talk about, which is that there's a shortened awards season this year. It's the shortest that it's ever been.
Yeah.
And there's such a crush of stuff for critics, for audiences to see at the end of the year. I just don't think that Just Mercy got that kind of traction because there's so much competition.
And we've seen it a lot that from October to December this year, there were just an incredible, unfathomable amount of things to see if you wanted to be up on the awards. And I think you've seen it play out, like all of there's so many of these movies that people just haven't seen.
Yeah.
And the sort of season goes on, but everybody's kind of got these big blind spots now.
Well, we'll get into why that may be in just a moment. Stay tuned. Let's look at the rest of the films. There's also a Underwater, which we mentioned, Kristen Stewart film, did not open in the top 5. Another holdover for Fox from the bygone era. Another disappointment for them, not in the top 5.
But well received from horror fans. So I feel like that one maybe VOD. It'll maybe find an audience over time.
Well, I cinema score though with a C, so it seems like it's a challenging film for audiences, and I think it was for Fox Disney, Disney Fox, whatever you want to call it. I hate to say it, but I think they just wanted to get it out over with and move.
It also has the co-star has been canceled since the film was made. Co-stars T.J. Miller.
Wow, they buried that because I had no idea.
He's like the second credited under Kristen Stewart, so I think that's also part of the reason why you don't have one of the stars to go out and promote like you normally would.
Well, that certainly may have generated headlines.
Fair enough. So I think that was also an issue with marketing it, which also probably led them to just be like, let's just wait for January and dump this.
Well, Underwater did not float in its debut. Sorry, terrible. Yeah. All right, let's look at the new chart that we do on the international box office chart. So this is the charting around the world. If you don't count North America, this is in every other country except for this one. Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker remains the highest grossing movie, not counting United States box office gross, followed by Jumanji: The Next Level, hot on its heels, right behind. That movie is sticking around, again, like its predecessor. People love this sequel. Then 1917 grossed $19.9 million outside of North America. That's good enough for third place. Frozen 2, right behind there at number 4, another holdover from the holiday season. And Spies in Disguise, which continues to do well, better outside the United States than it is inside the United States, which happens because there's a lot more territories. Sure. But it sticks around in the top 5. And I grabbed that poster. I believe that might be the Chinese poster because it has the date, the 22nd, which it's coming out there. But apparently they're marketing the animals.
Right.
In the
I was
film.
going to say the rare international poster that I don't necessarily like more than our domestic poster.
No, they're going with the animal angle there.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there was market tested to death, and that was the angle they decided was best. So
instead of humans
who were
look American.
Look like cartoon characters and animals, cartoon animals. Why not?
I don't know.
So when you put together the domestic chart we just showed and the international chart that we just showed, you get the worldwide box office for the past weekend. And in that one, 1917, the highest grossing movie in the world, all territories included, that we could get chart information for. $56 million is about a $90 million production before production advertising, still just right in the middle of its run. Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, number 2, followed by Jumanji, Frozen 2, and Spies in Disguise. So the same 5 movies, just in a bit of a different order due to 1917's really strong debut here domestically. It is the number 1 grossing movie worldwide. Again, good timing. It could have backfired. They maybe could have missed their window.
Oh, sure.
If you're at Universal. But, the critical acclaim, the awards, it seems to have worked in this case to hold back.
it's just what we were talking about. It's so crowded. Some things are going to get picked up. Some things are going to disappear. Like Little Women 2 is doing well. A big gamble to put it out at this time of the year, but one that now is obviously paying off for them in both nominations, and it's getting attention from audiences.
Yeah. Speaking of 1917, it repeats as also here domestically, the top grossing film per theater. It expanded to over 3,400 theaters from just, I believe, 11 last week. But due to the fact that it was kind of a slow weekend otherwise at the box office and the fact that it had a great debut, it grosses just over $10,775 per theater. That's good enough to repeat as the per theater champion once again. That we don't see as often. a movie that is the per theater winner in limited release, and then the next week is the per theater winner in wide release. Again, what seems to be a smart strategy paying off for this one.
I think a lot of this is the timing. Late award season, there was a lot of hype building up. All of a sudden, 1917 starts getting nominated for things, starts winning things. The Golden Globes happen. The movie hits theaters. I mean, it's just all at once. Everybody's talking about this movie that came out of nowhere, and I think people are rushing to go catch up and see it. So,
Lon, the other big story today, obviously, the Academy Award nominations came out. Just a few things before we start throwing some charts and figures at you. A few by-the-numbers things. Parasite becomes the 12th foreign language film to be nominated for Best Picture. The second consecutive year that a foreign language film has been nominated for Best Picture after Roma. That is the first time it's happened back-to-back like that. However, in 2006, there were two films largely in a foreign language that were nominated, Babel and Letters from Iwo Jima, nominated in the same year.
Right.
But back-to-back foreign language films nominated for Best Picture.
Notable, too, that Letters from Iwo Jima, an American director, a foreign language film. It's a Clint Eastwood movie.
Yes, exactly.
Gave
but
it a little
foreign language.
Right, but gave it a little like. If you look at the list of all foreign language films that have ever been nominated for Best Picture, it is a trend that does not go back that far. There's very few up until the 90s.
Yeah.
And then really the 90s, Crouching Tiger, those kind of movies opened the floodgates, and now it happens. It's still pretty rare.
Well, because distribution has opened up now that they're much more accessible. You can get it out to more people, both in the voting guilds and also the general public at large. I don't think 15, 20 years ago, Parasite could have been given the kind of release that it's gotten.
No, there were
found $30 million plus domestically.
Yeah, I mean, Crouching Tiger, also Ong Lee, a filmmaker who was already known in the U.S., and that was one of these movies that sort of started this trend of opening wide or getting an award season push. All of a sudden, international movies have more of a shot. Yeah. So it is, if you looked at that trend line, it's sort of flat until the 90s, and then it goes up all of a sudden.
Worth noting also for South Korea, Bong Joon-ho, obviously the director of Parasite, the first nomination for South Korea in the Best Picture race. So congratulations to Parasite and to Bong Joon-ho.
Oh boy, what a snub.
I am looking forward to seeing what that film does, because it wasn't just Best Picture, screenplay, director, production design. I was very happy to see it nominated. There are several nominations for Parasite.
And already has an HBO spin-off show announced. I mean, this is just, the ball is rolling now.
What a difference a few years makes, Lon. Netflix led every studio in overall Oscar nominations. Number one. So in a few short years, Netflix has gone from a fringe Oscar contender at best. Even last year, people thought, are they really going to nominate a Netflix film? Netflix leading all studios in nominations this year.
And it's more spread out this year. Like, Netflix did really well last year. I had 15 nominations last year, but 10 of them were just for Roma.
Yeah.
Whereas this year, you've got Irishman that did really well. You've got Marriage Story that did really well.
Two Best Picture nominees.
You also got American Factory.
Klaus.
You also got Klaus. Right. So it was more spread out this year. They're getting multiple projects. I was sad not to see Dolomite not more recognized, another Netflix film, but they're getting a lot of movies across the finish line and getting them nominations.
I Lost My Body, also another animated feature that was not produced by Netflix, but distribution handled. And so Netflix, as far as their campaigning, The Two Popes, doing
The Two Popes, that was the other one.
They really pulled off what appears to be a very successful awards campaign, and it's paid off with a lot of nominations for their movies. Obviously, the leading studio of all of them. A couple of great, amazing filmmakers and artists. John Williams breaks his own record to become the most Oscar-nominated person alive. He got his 52nd nomination for scoring Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker. And Martin Scorsese becomes the most nominated director alive. He picked up his 9th Best Director nomination for The Irishman from Netflix, obviously.
And there's a chance Thelma Schoonmaker could become, if she wins, she's nominated for Best Editor, she will become the most honored editor in Oscar history if she wins for The Irishman.
Well deserved. I mean, either way, one of the best editors of all time.
Yeah,
a genius, absolute genius. But Lon, as I mentioned before, Joker, first of all, breaks the record for most nominations for a movie based on a comic book film. 11 nominations. The second consecutive year where a movie based on a comic book character has been in the Best Picture race. Last year, Black Panther. This year, The Joker. Joker now has more nominations than any Dark Knight, you name it, any other film based on a comic book. And the most nominations overall, which is great news for Joker fans. Great news if you love the movie. However, don't want to rain on anyone's parade, but not necessarily a great harbinger for the film's hopes in the Best Picture race. I put together the stats. Since the year 2000, having the most nominations actually seems to be work out not in your favor more than it is your favor. Since 2000, Gladiators, you can see, had the most in 2000 that won. Fellowship of the Ring had the most. It lost. Chicago and Return of the King both won in back-to-back years. They had the most nominations. Aviator lost in 2005. Brokeback Mountain lost in 2005. 2004, sorry. Now, this is not the Oscar year. This is the movie year. Yeah. Dreamgirls leading nominations. It lost. Now, in 2007, that's a wash because you had two that tied. One of them won. One of them lost. Someone's got to lose. Then you have Curious Case of Benjamin Button, did not do it. Again in 2009, bit of a wash. Avatar and Hurt Locker. Hurt Locker won. King's Speech won back in 2010. In 2011, Hugo had the most. It lost. In 2012, Lincoln had the most. It lost. In 2010, you had a double loss. American Hustle and Gravity both tied for the most nominations. Neither won Best Picture. Then you had Birdman. That won in 2014. In 2015, The Revenant lost. In 2016, La La Land briefly won Best Picture, but then it lost. The Shape of Water, 13, it won in 2017. Last year, The Favorite, the most nominations of any film, it did not win. So more often than not, the film, at least this century, the film that has the most overall nominations going into the night, on average, does not win Best Picture, which seems kind of paradoxical, but it's just how the Oscars work sometimes.
It's interesting because it's not, I mean, we're looking at total nominations. So you would think if a movie's going to get a lot of the top kinds of nominations, writing, directing, acting, those would be more likely to take the top prize. But a lot of these movies we're seeing, a lot of them filled in the numbers on technical categories, which if a movie's getting nominated for sound and visual effects, that might make it less likely to get Best Picture because it's seen as genre or action oriented or sort of less serious by those kinds of Academy standards. I don't know if that will really come into play. Joker, maybe not a spectacle oriented movie, although it is interesting despite all of the attention it's gotten all award season long. It's sort of always been considered a movie that's probably going to get some nominations. It hasn't really been part of the handicapping what's going to win Best Picture conversation. I feel like that's been largely Irishman, Once Upon a Time, and Parasite.
I think a lot of it is because Joaquin Phoenix is so universally acclaimed. Even people I think that maybe have problems with the film in other areas will be the first to say, but Joaquin Phoenix is, and it's such a tour de force from him. I think so much goes to, I think when you're talking about Joker, you're talking about Joaquin Phoenix, you're talking about the sort of cultural discussion around the film, and then kind of following it up are the other award stuff. So is this a harbinger perhaps that it'll be a sleeper in the sense that it had more support than people had talked about just because there were so many other things to discuss, maybe, or it could be another case where it did so many things well, but another movie is going to snake in there and take the top prize.
I think Phoenix and the score and the cinematography are its real chances.
Well, I think Deakins is unbeatable this year for 1917. Honestly, he, in my opinion, he should be. They got a lot of making up to do with Roger Deakins, so I don't mind just giving him another one right away because. But what they did with 1917 was phenomenal, and so I think he's going to be hard to beat. But you never know. They're every year there are mortal locks that everyone knows are going to win, and they don't. And I don't think that right now any of the top categories, the top five, as they say.
The only one I feel,
the big five.
The big five.
I don't know if any. I would not call any of them absolute locks.
No, I don't think so.
Joaquin's the closest to being a lock.
Definitely not like we've seen in some years past. I was going to say the only major category that I feel very strongly about is I'm pretty sure Brad Pitt's getting that supporting actor trophy.
But you got Pesci out there.
Yeah, but I think Pesci and Pacino, the Irishman fans, get split.
Maybe so. I don't know. There's a lot of support for Pesci. Lon, we were talking about the fact that there's such a crush at the end of this season, and if you watched SJU this morning, I was actually fairly, let's say, passionate about the fact that now the way that the system works is everything seems like it comes out at one time. You have an abbreviated awards season now. People don't have time to watch everything.
No, it's not
there does seem to be conventional wisdom that takes over at a certain point, and the field almost narrows before the nominations are even out because the pundits, the whatever you want to call it, seemingly narrow the field for a lot of people. Right. Because there's so much going on. I came out and said, and I do believe this. I think that the Academy, if they're going to abbreviate the award season like that, needs to move to a juried nomination system where you have people still from the same guilds, but that commit to watching as much as they possibly can, only because there is so much. But I started thinking about the fact that has this always been the case? Because when you're looking at Best Picture, as I mentioned on today's show, of the 9 nominees for Best Picture this year, only one of them, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, was released prior to October. And so I was thinking, because I honestly I didn't know. I was like, has it always been like this, or is this somewhat of a new phenomenon? So we went back into the archives, went back to the 60s, because I figured the 60s is sort of the last of the old Hollywood era before the new blockbusters moved in,
right,
to see how things worked in the 60s. So these are Best Picture nominees from the 1960s, all of them, by release month. And as you can see, still, the beginning of the year, January, February, March, not a whole lot. But June, July, and August, about a little over 25% of the Best Picture nominees came from those 3 months. September had about 10%. October, as you can see, November, actually not a big month for Oscar nominations. So if you're looking at the 60s, the last 3 months of the year, October, November, December, accounted for less than half of the films nominated for Best Picture, which meant that more than half of the nominees came from the first 9 months of the year. So December, obviously, still a plum spot if you're releasing a movie with aspirations toward Best Picture. But that last half of the year, not as much of a barrage as far as the nominations go.
And in this era, it's going to be more organic. I mean, that is really a result of people who were voting on the Academy Awards probably just remembered movies they had seen recently.
There were fewer movies?
There were fewer movies. These were the ones that were fresher in their minds. And so you saw more. Now we're seeing the impact of that, but also the campaigns. And I'm sure we'll talk about this.
Whoa, boy, are we going to talk about that.
Oscar campaigning just radically shifted this whole, like, what it means to be an Academy voter, and how you would make these decisions.
So now we're going to move on to the 70s. This is the dawn of the blockbuster era, the dawn of more corporations buying into movie studios.
Jaws and Star Wars.
As you can see, December itself actually yielded fewer percentage-wise Best Picture nominees, but November grew a little bit, October grew a little bit, but still, even looking at those numbers, less than half, about 48% of the Best Picture nominees were from the last 3 months of the year. A little more than half were still from the beginning of the year. And actually, as you can see, movies like March, April, June, you have 10%. September. You were getting nominees still coming from the early part of the year. You're getting a little more backloaded, but still, most of your nominees not coming from the last 3 months of the year. December, again, remaining a very plum spot, as is tradition. Like, there are a lot of studios that have always held big prestige movies for the end of the year.
Sure. I mean, Christmas, people are out of work and school and going to see more movies. I mean, it's always been a movie-going time of the year. So that makes sense on that level.
So 60s, 70s, both decades. 70s gets a little more backloaded, but in both cases, still more than half the Best Picture nominees released in the first 9 months of the year.
Yeah.
Let's look at the 80s, and things start changing a little bit more. As you can see, December grows by leaps and bounds. In the 80s, films released in December alone accounted for 44% of the Best Picture nominees, and then for November, it's 8%. So now for the first time, you're seeing 52% of the nominated films for Best Picture coming from November and December alone, 60% coming from the last 3 months of the year. So in this decade, you start seeing the shift where now most of the movies nominated for Best Picture are coming from the last 3 months of the year.
Another fun shift to notice here in the 80s, when the summer blockbuster really came into its own.
Yeah.
Look how few nominees are coming from May through July. Right. August doesn't even get on there.
No, August isn't even there. January's not there.
Only 12%, because this is when summer became Masters of the Universe time. Like, the summer multiplexes got overtaken by popcorn movies, pushing all this more serious fare either earlier in the year or later.
So moving on to the 90s, and we're on the precipice of a real sea change, but that didn't really happen until the later 90s. But looking at the 90s here, December, 36% of your Best Picture nominees released in December. November, 18%. October, 4%. So again, about 60%, if I'm doing the math right. About 60% of your nominees coming in the last 3 months of the year, staying pretty consistent with the 80s, but you're seeing that sea change still.
And another thing that would have impacted it in this era would be Sundance. This is when the film festival culture really started to seep in. So the beginning of the year, Sundance is happening. You've got all these indie houses and Fox Searchlights and all that. Not yet, but those kinds of studios are popping up, and that's when you start. They're distributing those movies through August, through September. That's where a lot of those titles, your Sex Lies and Videotapes is
right. Well, because the distribution model changed, because when you introduced particularly the Sundance Film Festival, and the later film festivals like Toronto weren't quite as big yet. Right. It's the era of Sundance where you don't necessarily release your movies if you're a Clerks or if you're a Pulp Fiction. Right. If you're you get bought in January and they hold you till the fall, which is why you see September growing a little bit. You see August growing a little bit.
Swingers comes out at the end of the summer, but it was purchased at Sundance. Not that it's an awards, but you get what I mean.
Now, at the end of the 90s, there's a big change. Really, the shot heard around the world is when Saving Private Ryan lost to Shakespeare in Love. I'll just say H.W.
We all know the man's name. We don't want to get into it.
Miramax, the head of Miramax, really revolutionized the way that Oscar campaigns are done there was always campaigning, but pouring multi-millions of dollars into campaigns and really establishing what is now the modern Oscar campaign season.
Right. It used to be there were PR flacks and they would work for these studios, and it was a very in-person, hands-on sort of system. A PR flack would contact a bunch of Oscar voters and be like, hey, we're going to screen this thing. It was very informal, and what happened in the 90s, let's say, in the passive voice, is all of a sudden it became a much more corporatized, organized, commodified system to drive people to the movies that you wanted, and also messaging, like public messaging in the press, knocking this movie down, promoting this movie over it. All these conversations that
now campaigns,
all these conversations that now we expect. I mean, it's natural. It's the end of the year. There's going to be a piece about how Joker's not really as good as we thought, and why isn't anybody paying more attention to this project or whatever. That was unheard of until this era.
So we're now entering the 2000s. That new system has taken hold. And now, look at this. December releases now accounting for 45%. Now, this is the 2000 to 2009. We'll get to the 2010s in a minute. December now accounting for 45% of all Best Picture nominees. November accounting for 15% of all Best Picture nominees. So those 2 months alone now are accounting for 60% of nominees for Best Picture. You add in October, and now these 3 months, which previously had accounted for first less than half and then only about 60%, now accounting for 76% of Best Picture nominees in the 2000s. That means that the beginning of the year has now been squeezed to less than a quarter of the Best Picture nominees. This was a massive change, and this is the birth. This is also the birth, and we'll see as we got to the end of the decade, as the later year films began to dominate the Best Picture race, you had movies like The Dark Knight that were not getting nominated, that were getting shut out. And so the Academy changes their rules. They say, okay, we're going to expand the number of movies that can be nominated for Best Picture to allow for this growing film world. So you would think, great. These movies from the earlier part of the year that were getting lost in the crush of the last 3 months.
Now we've got
there's room for them. You would think that.
Not so.
This is the breakdown for the 2010s, including this year's nominations. December now accounting for 29% of all Best Picture nominees. November now accounting for 35% of all Best Picture nominees. October now accounting for 16% of all Best Picture nominees. If my math is right, I believe that's 80% now. So in the 2010s, in the first decade in which the first full decade in which the new Academy rules were put in place to allow for more Best Picture nominees, the percentage of films released in the last 3 months of the year nominated for Best Picture went up.
Yeah.
So it did not clear the way for more films that were released early in the year. It just gave more slots to this crush of films that are pushed at the end of the year at this modern campaign season. And that's why I say I think that you have to introduce some kind of a check and a balance here, because you're so flooded with options at the end of the year now because of the way they campaign. How do you even go back to the beginning of the year? You need people that do that.
And we also, one of the things that's now happening in the 2010s, especially the later part of the 2010s we already talked about, is now we have so many even more options because of all these streaming platforms. That in years past, it was only the major studios releasing things theatrically. But now you've got the major studios releasing things theatrically, plus several players in the online space releasing some things theatrically and some things on their platforms.
Yes.
They're all eligible for Oscars, and many of them do sneak into the conversation. So if you're coming out earlier in the year, you have to make such an impact. You have to make such a dent in the pop culture landscape that people can remember it 8 months later, 9 months later, through this glut of hundreds of movies.
And that's not fair to those films.
No, of course not. And it's definitely not. I mean, you have to think about, we're talking about stuff like Gladiator, Get Out, like these kinds of cultural event movies.
MASH was a January. In 1970, MASH was a January release. Silence of the Lambs was a February release.
Right.
Those movies all won the Oscar over a year after they came out.
Yeah, and if you think about something like Silence of the Lambs, no matter how well-reviewed or beloved a movie like that was, if you had a horror movie opening in February, we saw it. It was called Us, and everybody saw it and liked it, and it didn't get a single nomination.
Yeah.
And I feel like, that's the situation that we're in now. It's just there's so much coming at the end of the year that you have to be literally the biggest movie of the year if you come out early for people to remember.
The three movies that came out, I was looking at this, the only three movies in this decade that got a Best Picture nomination from either January, February, or March were Black Panther last year and Get Out 2 years ago, and Grand Budapest Hotel, which came out in March.
And honestly, Grand Budapest is surprising only because of the name brand of Wes Anderson, I would think, in that case.
Those are the only three movies that came out in the first few months of the year. So it's almost like if you have ambitions to play in the Oscar race, unless you have brand recognition, or unless you have a seismic cultural impact like Black Panther and Get Out did,
Get Out,
you literally stand almost no chance, because if the question is, it seems like fewer movies than ever from the beginning of the year get nominated, percentage-wise, that is true. Percentage-wise, there have never been fewer movies from the first 9 months of the year. Less than a quarter of the movies this decade nominated for Best Picture were made in the first 9 months of the year. You can't tell me that it's all down to quality filmmaking being done at the end of the year. There's just so much. So my proposal would be, at the beginning of every year, the Academy has lined up, and every different guild, because editors nominate editors, costume designers nominate costume designers. You line it up so that they know come January 1, I'm on the jury for the Academy nominations, for the Academy nominating committee this year. The Academy, I'm sure, given those names, could arrange screenings, could arrange screeners. And as a professional and as an Academy member, that you are responsible for seeing and taking notes and remembering all of these movies. But if you know as an Academy member at the beginning of the year that you will be nominating your favorites, I think you're going to do what a lot of critics do and what I do. As the year goes, I take notes. I log what I watch. I think of when I'm going to my list at the end of the year. I go back and I look at everything I've watched, and I write it all down, because I don't want to leave out these movies that came out earlier in the year.
You would have to give people, even in the Academy, you'd have to give them a greater sense of responsibility and duty than they currently have. Because critics are going to do that, but the average moviegoer is not taking notes on stuff.
But if you're an Academy member, you should already have that sense of responsibility, at least to the artisans and the craft people that make movies. That you would think they'd have the utmost respect. But even inside of that, I'm not saying it's a random selection. I say they approach you, they
like
ask
a film festival jury.
Yeah, exactly. So it's never going to happen. First of all, never going to happen. But the fact of the matter is, it's statistically harder than ever for anything made before October to break through to Best Picture. So, as I said, I'm a fan of every movie to an extent that's nominated for Best Picture. The only thing that I hate is I feel like there are so many great movies that came out earlier that just were never in, or a small movie like Waves that came out in that window that just got lost.
I'll tell you what I think is a shame is we've got all of these categories, and there's so many movies that are good at different things. And there's this idea that if a movie's good, it should be nominated in every category. So you have all of these, it's one movie and it's got 11 nods or 10 nods or 8 nods. And that keeps happening. And sure, some movies are, everything about them is great. But I wish we spread it out a little bit more. I wish there was recognition that not every movie is going to do everything perfectly. Some movies are going to have great cinematography. Some movies are going to have great music. Some movies are going to have this performance is great. It's a screenplay.
Yeah.
It doesn't all have to be like Marriage Story is up for literally everything, even if you like Marriage Story.
It's the Joker for costume design thing. It's like, there's so many amazing things about Joker, but like, have you seen a lot of the other movies that were Dolomite,
like
Rocketman, Downton Abbey, all of those films, unless there's some technical thing I'm missing, I would say I would put that in. That's not a slight on Joker.
Right. That would be my wish. It's like, I don't think we need as many movies that are racking up 8, 10, 12 nominations. I think it would be better. And I do feel like it used to, I don't have the stats for this, but I do feel like it used to be more like that. It was rare for a movie to, like, Titanic got what, 10, 11?
Well, Titanic, I think, got 14 because it was tied for the most all time with like All About Eve and Ben-Hur. And
it was really rare when that happened. Like, movies didn't usually get that many nominations. I feel like every year now we've got something that gets 9, 10, 11.
Well, let's Ryan on the board. Thank you, Ryan. Ryan, can you throw up that graphic about the most nominations again? Yeah, let's look at, because we got the numbers since 2000. Gladiator had 12. Fellowship of the Ring had 13. Chicago
so I guess
had 13.
There's always like 1 or 2 that gets that many.
Yeah, I mean, you see that a lot, but that's not, generally, as I mentioned, it's not necessarily a harbinger that they're going to do great things. And I would go back and say that the majority of those films probably didn't even win most of those awards that they were nominated for.
Yeah, because it's like one movie getting 14 nods, but then like all this great stuff, Hustlers and Uncut Gems and all these other movies that people love that didn't get any. It's just a shame.
Yeah, there's just a lot of great work that I understand if they're on the same playing field and they lose out, but I honestly just believe that because of the circumstances of how the Oscar campaigns are run now, I don't think any of them stood a chance, or a lot of them did, and I just don't think that's fair to the people who worked just as hard and I think whose movies are just as good as the ones nominated. In some cases, I think some of them are better. That's subjective, but it's really giving everyone an equal chance to get nominated and succeed. And you don't want just the same. As I mentioned, I put this stat out on Twitter today. For narrative features, there were 104 available nomination slots. There were 34 different movies represented out of 104 slots available, which means that 2/3 of the Oscar nominations were repeat nominations for the same films.
And that's where stuff like The Farewell should be getting in the door.
I would love to have seen Uncut Gems in the editing race, or Waves in the cinematography race, or The Farewell for screenplay, or Awkwafina in there for Best Actress. I'm not saying that these are better than necessarily who's in there. It's just that I don't think, because of how campaigns are run, that they necessarily had the same shots as the handful of films that were sort of ordained and designated as the front runners. And I think if you go to a juried system, you could potentially fix that, because then you have a smaller group of people who are able to sit and watch and have an extra sense of duty to remember that kind of thing. That's Dan's dream world. Never going to happen. Lon, thanks for going down this rabbit hole with me.
Oh, of course.
The Oscars, I'm sure we'll have many more stats as we get closer to the Oscars, which are in like less than a month.
I know.
It's crazy.
We were doing them in March for a while.
The Golden Globes,
I got comfy.
Like 5-10 years ago, the Golden Globes wouldn't even have happened yet, because they were always over the Martin Luther King holiday here in North America, and the Oscars were in March,
the first week in March,
the first or second week in March, and here we are. They're going to be February 9th. So, lots of Oscar stats, lots more box office stats, and there's other things that we were tracking like Star Wars, etc. Update next week, but we want to do a big Oscar show, and you know me, if I see a little wormhole, I'm just gonna get sucked right into it.
We're all working on our Joker dances now. Don't worry.
Exactly. Yep. Finding some good stares around here. Before we go, let's look at the 2020 worldwide and domestic list. No movement on the 2019 list. I'll update those as needed.
Sure.
This is the 2020. I'm sorry, the U.S. domestic box office. And you know what? I just said let's throw up everything eligible. So congratulations afterward. You've only made $6,500 at the box office, but you're on Charting with Dan. Les Miserables, by the way, the French foreign language film nominee. I don't quite know how it works, because this was its first weekend and limited release here in the. It's somehow qualified for the foreign lit, but it's the nominee from France. So congratulations.
Must have played in New York somewhere or something.
Yeah, Chapak, which is an Indian film.
Sure.
There, $316,000. Underwater, as you see, at number 3, Like a Boss, and The Grudge. Congratulations. Still at number 1. Now, if you're sitting there wondering, wait, didn't 1917 just open to $37 million? You're correct, it did, but because it opened in limited release in 2020, even though it's going to make 99% of its money in 2020, it opened in limited release in 2019, it counts as a 2019 release. So for now, The Grudge stays on top of the box office until, I don't know, Doolittle or something knocks it off. Bad Boys for Life actually is probably likely to knock it off. So that's
your number one. Your new number one.
Yeah, your new number one. It's probably going to be Bad Boys for Life. Get used to it. That's the 2020 U.S. domestic box office. Let's look worldwide, and I broadened my scope on because people were right. The Gentleman was open last week, but it wasn't on the sites that I was checking. So I tried looking on more sites to fill out this list. So I'm doing the best I can as far as getting accurate results. They're very difficult to find.
It's
globally.
very hard because here in the U.S., publishers just assume you are only interested in the U.S. ever. So finding international data can be challenging.
So like weekend numbers from all around the world are not necessarily easy to find because they're not breathlessly reported and updated in the same way.
They assume Americans don't care or are even vaguely aware that there are other countries.
Yes. Yeah. So sorry. You may have information that puts some of these higher or lower. I am doing the best we can. Tolo Tolo is still there at number 1, $40 million. Then The Grudge at number 2. Then we have The Gentleman. That's the new Guy Ritchie film. That's already open in the UK.
Another week or two?
Yeah, I think it's coming down here in a week or two.
I've seen all the press starting to go.
Then Underwater and Like a Boss there, number 4 and 5. Tanhaji, The Unsung Warrior, an Indian release. Doolittle was released, and I believe it was South Korea a week early, so it's already making some money.
I don't believe that's a real movie.
You don't believe it? Well, we'll find out next week.
Doesn't that feel like a fake movie it feel like a Tropic Thunder movie in a movie?
I'll tell you this, Lon. I was supposed to be sitting in a theater right this second watching Doolittle because it was at 5 o'clock, but I wasn't done with charting.
You're missing Doolittle?
I'm missing Doolittle
for this?
I'm missing Doolittle for you, Lon, and for all of you at home. I'm sorry if you were waiting for my Doolittle review.
You could have finally confirmed with me if it is in fact a real movie.
Well,
I don't believe it.
I cannot confirm or disconfirm that at this point. But
once I saw a polar bear voiced by John Cena in the Peruvian hat, I was like, I don't believe it.
You know what threw me off is I was watching the movie. I was watching the trailer for the movie, and it was just like, oh yeah, Robert Downey Jr. It's an adventure with animals, and then it's like a second movie's trailer got spliced in because they're like, you didn't tell me there was gonna be a dragon, and then a dragon flies out, and it's like, I'm like, whoa.
It does not look like a real movie.
Well,
I'm not sure I believe it.
I could have been in a position to confirm you, but I was tallying numbers for too long, Lon, so I apologize.
I admire your commitment.
Number 9, one day we'll talk about today. I believe that's an Indonesian film. Then Chapak, as I mentioned, and Hamamet there at number 9 and number 10. Of course, we'll see some movement on this chart as we go throughout the weeks in 2020. And Lon, before we leave, one last bit of business. The Countdown is wrapped up, but we started a new feature last week called The Countdown to New Mutants.
Maybe.
Still not convinced it's going to hit theaters. As you can see, we're 82 days away from New Mutants supposedly hitting theaters and 640 days away from its original opening date. I hope a red line doesn't go through that 82 days number line.
I'm really hoping.
See.
I got my hopes up now.
Any new news on the New Mutants? There was a trailer for it last week.
Yeah, that was last week we talked about the new trailer. I haven't heard any updates yet. At this point, no updates is good.
Yeah, as of today, it's still being released in theaters.
They haven't shifted it off that date, so I'm hoping.
So, I mean, we're less than 3 months away. I'm going to give it a good until we're down to 3 or 4 days away before I'm really convinced that we're gonna get there.
Yeah, honestly, any day they could be like, we're gonna put it on Hulu, and I'd be like, yes, that makes sense.
And that's why it's not a countdown. It's a countdown.
Countdown to when it's on Hulu.
Yeah, countdown to something.
Yeah,
we'll see. Lon, that is less than 90 days away from New Mutants, maybe. Then that's our show. Thank you for joining me, Lon. Thanks for listening to me yap about Best Picture decades and all that fun stuff.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you for sticking around and tuning in a little later than usual. I believe next week is the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday here in North America.
Yes.
So there will not be a charting next week because we'll be off, but we'll be back 8 days from today, next Tuesday, to cover the box office, Doolittle, Bad Boys, all the stuff that's coming out this week, the Oscars, what got a bump, what didn't get a bump, all that fun stuff. Until then, we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.